The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 16th chapter. From that time on, after Peter confessed that Jesus was the Messiah, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you." But Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Then Jesus told his disciples, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Well, happy Labor Day, everybody. This is that holiday where we get to pause and give thanks for the gift of labor in this country and the prosperity it has brought us by providing an opportunity for a day off of work and an opportunity to rest and celebrate together. For some of you, though, who might not be unaware, a day off is this thing where you don't work. I know. It's crazy. There's also this thing called a Sabbath, but we won't get into that today. So, as I think about this work, this kind of work that we're each called to, and how ultimately it's meant to provide towards the common good among us, and as I was thinking about today's readings, there was this question that kept kind of rattling around in my head. And it's this question of, how often do we get into a job or some kind of work without knowing exactly what we're signing up for, or knowing the full picture of what we might be facing? So an example of that, most of you know that before I went to seminary, I worked at a church as a youth director. Now, it's been a long time, but I still vaguely remember sitting down with the two pastors of that church for my interview. And I can sort of remember, that we talked for quite a while, and I'm sure there were a lot of questions asked, but there was one question that I still vividly remember. And it was when they looked at me and they said, when you work with youth, how do you deal with discipline? And I remember that question because I also remember one voice in my head thinking at that moment, that sounds like a really pointed question. I wonder if there's a reason they're asking me this. And then I remember another voice in my head at that same time shouting, "Run away!" While I don't remember exactly what I actually said, I'm sure I just rambled on about how important discipline is and how I wouldn't be afraid of dealing with it if I needed to. Well, in my 4 years there, I found out there was indeed a reason, multiple reasons actually, why they asked that question in my interview. But you know as well as I do, if they would have been as upfront about all of those things from the beginning, I probably would have listened to that one voice and run away as fast as I could. Sometimes it's for the best that we don't know all of the information before we walk into some situation. And I think that's part of what Jesus was doing when he was being so secretive about this whole discipleship and following stuff. So as I was telling the kids, the gospel story we heard today actually began with what we heard last week. And so last week, Jesus and his disciples enter the district of Caesarea Philippi, and as they walk along, Jesus asks them, "Who do people say that I am? Who is the Son of Man to those around you?" And the disciples answered it. They gave all kinds of answers from what they've been hearing the crowd say, but then Jesus changes the question and looks right at them and says, who do you say that I am?" And if you were here or remember this story, we know that the disciple, Simon Peter, gave the right answer. He said, "You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And we heard Jesus was thrilled. Jesus bestows a blessing upon Peter. He says that Peter is the rock upon which his church would be built, and that Peter will get the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And then, at the end of that portion of the story that we heard last week, Matthew's gospel says, "Then Jesus sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah." We've talked a little bit about that before, this idea that we call the messianic secret. Those times when Jesus tells his disciples, or he reveals who he is, and then tells his disciples to not say anything. To us who have been called and sent to share this good news of Jesus with the world, hearing Jesus tell his followers to keep it a secret has always seemed odd. But, as we've learned, we know that those disciples don't yet know the whole story. They don't know the ultimate truth of what Jesus is doing, which becomes more evident in what we hear in today's portion of the gospel. And so we heard from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, undergo great suffering, be killed, and on the third day be raised. That is a lot to take in, right? And as we often talk about, it's completely opposite of everything those disciples, those faithful Jewish disciples, believed and hoped about their coming Messiah. They believed that their Messiah, that one who would save their people from oppression, would come with power and might, and would come to conquer the king and the emperor, not face suffering and death. So, of course, Peter, who loves Jesus so much, speaks up again. He says, "God forbid it, Lord, this cannot happen to you." And then Jesus looks at him and gives that very memorable reply, "Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block for me. You're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." How quickly things go from Peter the rock to Peter the adversary, Peter the Satan. Peter did not yet know or understand the full scope of this job that he has gotten himself into, which in turn gets him a scolding from Jesus. That's always been an interesting reply from Jesus, right? "Get behind me, Satan." And while that name that Jesus calls Peter, this name of Satan, doesn't necessarily name him as the devil, it's more of the term of being an adversary. Now we need to think back, because this isn't the only time that Jesus has used this phrase in the gospel. Way back at the beginning of his ministry, the first thing that happens to Jesus is that he's taken out into the wilderness where he's tempted by the devil for 40 days. And Jesus stands up to those temptations, and at the end of those 40 days, he banishes the devil by saying, "Away with you, Satan. Depart from me, you adversary." Which is nearly the identical phrase that Jesus uses here towards Peter, except that Jesus tells Peter to literally depart to behind me, you adversary. It's almost as if Jesus is telling Peter, hey, you're being an adversary because you don't understand. Get out of my way and get behind me so that you can follow me, so that you can know and learn what I am doing. Because after that, Jesus turns to all the disciples and begins to give those instructions as to how they are to follow. He says, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. Okay, again, not the clearest of information as they begin this journey, but at least an allusion to what is to come. Take up your cross, he says, and follow. A couple weeks ago, when I was reading through this passage to start preparing for today, I was smacked upside the head with something I don't think I'd ever considered, which is, what cross was Jesus talking about? Jesus obviously at this point in the story had not yet been crucified. He is just now telling his disciples that part of what he has come to do will include his suffering and death. But even then, he doesn't mention that it's a death on the cross. So does Jesus know how his death is to come about? And this phrase is a foreshadowing of that? Or does this reference to the cross, which is actually the second time that Jesus has said this? The first time was back in chapter 10. Does this reference to the cross point to something else? Every now and then I'll see something online that's meant to be, funny and lighthearted, where someone points out a piece of ancient artwork of Jesus and his life and ministry, and somewhere in that artwork there's a cross or a crucifix hanging on the wall behind him. Or there's this other piece of art where Jesus is talking to his disciples and he's wearing a cross necklace. And you look at that and think, why is there a cross in this picture? Isn't it a little too early for this? Is the artist getting ahead of themselves? It really was bugging me what Jesus meant by telling his followers to take up their cross. So I began to dig into some books to try and find some clarity, and you won't believe what I found. Ready? People don't agree on what he means. People don't agree on what Jesus meant. I can't believe it. So some scholars thought that maybe Jesus didn't actually say that, didn't use that term, and that this take up your cross was later added by the writer of Matthew's gospel, because those readers of the gospel would know then the depth of what Jesus was talking about. That makes sense. But there are a lot of other scholars who really thought, no, Jesus did say that. There's plenty of evidence for that. But because the crucifixion had not happened yet, that term would carry a completely different depth of meaning for those disciples. Yes, they would know that word, cross, to be that torturous device of execution that was used by the Roman Empire. Disciples would recall all the times they had seen the Roman prisoners carrying their own cross up the hill to their execution, just as Jesus did. But they would also understand this idea of cross to signify a totally different kind of lifestyle to which they were being called. A lifestyle of self-denial and service and sacrificial love. Things that were so countercultural that it ultimately landed Jesus on the cross for his own death. I think that's where Jesus was going in this conversation with his disciples. He begins with a test to see whether or not they would name him as the Messiah, which they did. And then he went on to see if they really knew what the Messiah was going to do and how the Messiah would accomplish it. Now, there's also one other offhanded comment, a seemingly offhanded comment at the start of this story that we heard last week. telling us where they were. It said, as they came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, Jesus asked his disciples. So they were walking into the heart of Roman power. They were in a place that had reminders of Emperor Caesar all around them. And in that place where they were, with all those reminders, that is where Jesus tells them to take up their cross. Not only would that lifestyle be countercultural, it would be counter-imperial. The things that they would be doing would fly in the face of all the powers that be. And it could bring suffering, and it could bring death. Could you imagine walking into a job interview and being faced with those facts? Yes, some people still willingly do that in service and protection of the greater community, but if that's not what you were signing up for, would you turn around and walk out? If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. This is a call, if not a demand, to a completely different way of life than what we usually see around us. To set our mind on divine things, not on human things. And while it could lead to suffering and death, I don't believe that Jesus is calling us into this masochistic, look how much I can suffer for the sake of God kind of life. I think that too misses the point of the humbleness to which we're being called. And have you ever heard the phrase of someone being so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good? So heavenly minded that they're no earthly good. This call to follow, to get behind Jesus and go where he leads, is meant to bring good news and wholeness and love and life to this world. And while life in this world is continually passing away, losing our life for the sake of the cross is a witness to the love and the new life that can only come from God. Amen.